the topic is really about Linux. Tux is the symbol of Linux. I'm sure you've seen that over the years, a penguin and in its various forms. And it's 30 plus years since Linux was invented. This talk I did do sort of when it was sort of the tail end of beginning of last year, when it was 38 years. It's come up to 31 and a half years now. So it's 3 decades Linux has been around. And that's interesting in the actual industry we work in, that something can have such longevity. You know, I've been in IT, this is my 40th year in IT, and lots of things have gone by the by. If I think back to my ICL days, VME, back to my DECVAX days, which Carl will remember at Stafford. Certain players have gone out of the market and certain operating systems have disappeared. I worked on IBM systems for many years, and those have also, things like AS400s, 600s, and the operating systems for those have disappeared. So we've got something here which has had an impact and is continuing to have an impact. So I've got some perspectives here for you. It's not a lecture. There's only 20 content slides, you'd be pleased to know, and there's time at the end for some questions, debate, examples from your own perspective. Okay, so next slide, please. So, yes, as I've already mentioned, it's really 31 years now. Talk was delayed by COVID, really, and all sorts of things like this. So Linux, it's an OS, an operating system, born circa 1991 in Helsinki, a student there who created it. The story goes that really it was to do with money, that at that time, and I remember it well, things were very proprietary. You had to pay for licenses. So really, to operate something, you had to have a license for it. And the big player at that time was Unix, which is still used in industry. There are still machines running out and out Unix, but Unix, a licensed product, I would have moved over. I bought some of my old Unix stuff in, which is on another table. And it just shows the age of how long Unix has been around. But one of the books is sort of now a brown color. The pages have actually sort of tinged with brown. And I have a crib sheet, which I had back when I was at Stafford as a student and over the years using Unix. But the important point is that it's proprietary. There's some sort of fee involved to use it. Okay, so happy with that. Carl mentioned John Hopkinson. I've still got my notes from degree days where they were handwritten and all about Unix, and we were taught operating systems, about the infrastructure, the architecture of OSs, and that really stood in good stead, out in industry, understanding how things work, things like file systems, memory, all these kind of things, which to some extent have become almost really sort of like a utility. We don't need to know about those. There are lots of sort of roles now in industry and IT are on sort of high level. You don't really need to know about all the sort of the gubbins inside. But we would argue, certainly at this university, that it is important to know those things. And I'll come on to that shortly in terms of what we teach our students on the various courses here. There's a sort of a level of sort of understanding which we expect. Okay, so we're celebrating really Linux being around for so long. I do remember when Linux appeared, it was really quite a shock, because suddenly we had this open source OS. And perhaps it didn't sort of go off with a bang. There were no fireworks as such, but it was monumental in terms of something which I'd been using, which are proprietary. Things like I mentioned before, other machine ranges, which all had their own proprietary operating system. I was working for a software house, sort of in the 90s, and we had different machines had to have different OSs. So it was complicated. You had to have experts in different things. Suddenly, Linux came along, which is Unix-like, and I'll come on to that. And this was a whole new landscape, really, that we had this open source, no license required, free, and we could actually then deploy our applications, which would run on the Linux as any Linux box that was actually built. Okay, just to sort of the tail end of this slide, and this is stuff you already know, really, of course. The world revolves around desktops and servers. So really, desktops, the king of the desktops from OS is Windows. All the statistics show that. Linux does have a desktop version. You can download it to a desktop, and I've got versions on desktops, but I've also got things like on my laptops, for example. I've got a partition where I've got Linux on one partition and I've got Windows on the other. Okay, the big sort of use of Linux that has appeared over certainly the last 5 years, 6 years, has been part of the cloud revolution, where we've got software as a service, the service industry, things like AWS, Google, all these CSPs really, that cloud providers typically have Linux platforms. And I'll come on to that in some examples shortly. The final point there, the other little bullet point there, of course, what we've seen really with the PC market, the laptop market, is really less of a laptop where you install things, more of a laptop which talks to the cloud. So the Chromebook idea, there again, hasn't been something which has perhaps had too many fireworks, but it's quite an interesting trend in terms of, well, why do I need to have to be bothered with installing things? I just need to connect to things. So there's a trend there sort of in terms of the industry, certainly in the UK, Europe and worldwide. Okay, next slide, please. So statistics, obviously statistics are statistics, and you can argue from different points. But if I just pick out a few of these, it's quite startling how Linux is used. Look at the third point there. Linux powers 85% of smartphones. Okay, most smartphone users won't even know that. They just think, well, I can think of quite a few people sort of in the family, etc. If I say to, well, what kind of smartphone is it? Is it Android or iOS? They say, I don't know. I just got it from EE. Why do I need to know that? But it's been so popular. So that's interesting. Why is it so popular sort of in that market? It's the third most popular desktop OS. Okay. So, small market share, but I think that could grow. We'll come on to that. It's the supercomputers, sort of, the big data centers out in the world, all the kind of stuff you can actually send work to. They're running on Linux. So from a server point of view, it's definitely got a hold of the market. It's become almost like the de facto server. Typically goes with things like LAMP servers. So you'll have a Linux, it's sort of Apache, sort of SQL server, MySQL, sort of, PHP type of server, which you can get over things like, GoDaddy and all these providers. So small firms typically looking to have a server deployment will have a LAMP server provided by their provider, and they can actually sort of use the space on that. AWS sort of offer that kind of service as well, Amazon Web Services, where you can actually obviously scale the amount of use you want. So going down that sort of utility market, really, where really firms just want to use something rather than having to actually look after it themselves. I come from a background over the 4 decades where really we had to look after stuff. We had, if I think back to my sort of mainframe days in the 80s, well, operations and development and analysis was separated. You didn't go into the operations room, we were in the development area. And then of course we had the mini computer boom where we started to look after it within our own firm. And then of course what we've now got, of course, is moving away from that really. So, well, it's in the cloud, we just connect to it and how we deploy that. So Linux has been part of that sort of revolution really. And that continues, and that's really where we are at the moment in 2023. Okay. So, a sort of reference there from where those stats have come from. Okay. Next slide, please. So, in my perspectives of Linux, having used it for many, many years, you can probably guess I'm enthusiastic about it. So I'm not an evangelist about Linux, but I love the whole ability to control things, to get involved in all the gubbins. It's always appealed to me, really. But I'm also a big Windows user. So this is not an anti-Windows talk. I see the role of Windows, and I'm old enough to remember the early versions of Windows. And I use Windows every day, and it's in the university here, etc. And as I mentioned before, typically I'll have a partition on the laptops or the PCs I'm actually using. So it's been a constant for me, really, over the last 30 years. It's something I've lived with. But it's something which you don't always hear talked about. You don't have sort of Linux conversations. So it's been part of my work life because we've used it in the various firms I've worked for. And I continue to use it with the stuff I'm doing with innovation projects with small firms at the moment, who typically haven't got much money, typically want something set up, which may have a server component, want something that can perform well within a budget. So that really probably haven't got the expertise to know about Linux, but are quite happy that we come up with a sort of a plan of what we're going to deploy. Okay, so enterprise applications, moving into sort of the space that used to be part of the big firms, SMEs can actually use enterprise applications. So there's lots of open source products out there which can run in the cloud and gives them the leverage that a big firm would have. So it's a long-lived OS. Okay, it's great to tinker with. That's probably how to get into it, and anybody online or in the room today will know if they're using Linux. That's where you start, really. You start, and it's quite addictive, really. You sort of build up your knowledge of it and sort of walk around. The crib list still applies. I have a little Linux card which I give to my students, and I've got my old Unix card, and it's sort of just, sometimes you get used to the certain commands, but a little crib list of the most used commands is quite a useful way to actually get into it, really. And of course, just take your time navigating around it. It's a lot to it. It's very, very powerful. So what we say sort of for the courses we run at the university is just be careful. For example, remove directory is quite powerful. Sort of find that they've tinkered with something and then, oh, right, well, that's gone. It's different if you're using a command line interface, which I'll just come on to. Of course, you're putting that command in, then you're sending it. It will do what you've asked it to do. When you're faced with a GUI and you're moving around, there's almost like a bit of a visual sort of thing. Well, okay, is that what I want to do? So there's sort of something that you bear in mind there in terms of the actual visualization of Linux. But fundamentally, with Linux, you are the sysadmin. You're in control, which is, of course, from my point of view, when it first appeared 30 years ago, plus, I thought, wow, this is wonderful. I'm in control of how we deploy this. You've got you've got root directory control. Next slide, please. Those are some of my perspectives about Linux, which hopefully sort of ring a bell with you. Other reflections about Linux? Well, I still use the command line interface, very comfy with that because I grew up with the DOS generation. So it doesn't mean no qualms at all. As you'll see in a later slide, that's what we do with the students on level 4 here, the first year of the degree. We actually get them doing some command line interface, which at first they find a little bit of a shock because, of course, they've gone through school doing no command line interface typically, unless they've done it with things like a Raspberry Pi or Arduino, but they've typically been in some sort of Windows sort of a GUI environment. And they do exist. The most popular, the two that I use are GNOME 3 now, which is a nice, simple sort of GUI interface for Linux. And there's another one called Budgie, which I've used over the years. And that's very collegiate. It's sort of, you can actually sort of get help from it and exchange, sort of in like a community sense. But fundamentally, Linux is quite pedantic, like all OSs really. You've got to be careful about what you're doing, think ahead. What am I trying to actually achieve, rather than sort of crash around. So typically, somebody new to it, you don't let them loose on everything, perhaps give them a user control, which has some limitations. It's case sensitive, but the great things about it, it's collegiate. It's part of that open source movement. So everything's in life, as you all know, it's double-edged. So the great edge is that it's collegiate. It's part of the open source movement. There is another side, which we'll come on to as I get towards the end, because that can work both ways. So open source, fantastic. We've seen a boom in sort of open source software out there. Sort of free to share, those kind of things. And it's got that kind of, I've put hub vibe there, sounds pretty awful really, but it's got that sort of enthusiast sort of feel about it. You're with a community worldwide, so you can actually see what's going on. There's various projects which I'll come on to, which are going on at the moment, which you can get involved with. You can even get involved with actually the kernel, which I'll explain in a moment. It's the kernel being about 13 million lines of code written in C, and that's what it really is, Linux. But the kernel is moving as well. It's not static. It's something which is still being developed. So easy, intuitive, great to sort of, you can set up your own structures, all those kind of things. You're very much sort of, in charge of it, really. You feel that you're not being led, and here you are, you just use it. With Linux, you can build your own sort of infrastructure. Next slide, please. So what makes it special? Why is it popular? We've got to try and actually sort of address that question. Well, of course, cost, it's free, does help. But it's lightweight. And what do I mean by that? Well, it can be used on old equipment. So I've got various tower PCs, which typically end up in a skip. But yeah, most firms, colleges, universities, where they sort of have their life, and they just sort of right, we'll just send them off to be either recycled or actually decommissioned. But you can use those. You can put Linux on them. So I've got some old sort of Pentium sort of tower blocks, tower PCs, which Linux is quite happy to run on, and you can actually run applications on it. So it's got lower memory demand, lower demands on hardware. There's even a very lightweight version of Linux, various ones out there, thing called Puppy Linux, where you can actually run an even extreme lightweight version of it. So it can be used on, I haven't put a photo of one of my towers. I was going to take a photo of one in the garage at home, which I've used for many years. But you get the idea, really. If I see an old box that somebody's about to chuck out, I said, well, I'll just have that, please. I can do something with that. So I have to hide them around the house back at home. I've got some on the desk. My wife sort of said, wait a minute, where's that computer come from? Don't worry, it's but they can they can be used for all sorts of things, either desktop or setting up a server. Okay, so you can set up your own servers on site, at home, at work, etc. Or of course you can use hosted service providers as well. So who will offer a Linux server? I put your own server there, or typically you actually sort of use their servers that they've got available, either a blade or a box which you want to dedicate to your own use. So you'll find in the cloud service providers, CSPs, have a very popular range of sort of Linux distributions, distros as we call them. So Ubuntu is a very common one that you see sort of advertising their specifications of what you can have as a service. Which leads on to the kernel, which we'll go on to the next slide for me, Charlie. So the kernel really is Linux. The OS is really everything else. So Linux is an OS, but the fundamental thing is the kernel. And as I say, really, the kernel actually is ongoing development. And what does that do? The kernel, well, obviously, it's almost like an analogy with nature, really, the kernel being the core of the architecture. It's telling the CPU what it can do, input, outputs, drivers, file systems, all these kind of things. And itself is an open source project. So really, you can become part of that collegiate kernel development if you've got the time and obviously the enthusiasm to do it. And I've put a reference there, which you can follow up on if you'd like to do that. We'll make these slides available, obviously, sort of on the BCS branch website. So that's really something which was first developed back in 91, and it's developed, it's improved, it's added. Of course, it needs to be continually updated because, of course, new devices appear, Linux needs to talk to them, etc. So it's an ongoing sort of development. Next slide, please. I've mentioned reuse of old kits or redundant kits already. I've put a couple of links in there for you. I think it's quite a green IT agenda, really. That's quite interesting. Firms often see, well, I've got to go and buy something new. And I say, well, hold on a minute. How much budget have you got? And do you have to buy new? What have you got in the department or the firm at the moment that we could use? So that could be old machinery. This is really part of that Industry 4 and stroke Industry 5 framework, which is very much sort of industries trying to actually pick up on, that we can actually make use of things which can have some sort of a sensor put onto them. We can make use of an old sort of IT box, which we can repurpose, reload it with a different sort of OS. So it's all part of that, really. So there's plenty of distros really for older PCs, as little as 100 meg of RAM. Now, if you said that's just crazy when you think 100 meg of RAM is sort of old school. When you think of what you actually now buy, that people say, what? How can you survive on that? But of course, if you think about what's happened with things like storage since the 90s, when you think really, I once bought a box which was an external drive for a PC. I got a budget from my managing director for a 120 megabyte external drive. Which is just mind-bending to think this is 1994. I've had to sort of buy something which was actually quite expensive at the time for 120 megabytes of extra storage. It's laughable now, really, in terms of how things have obviously sort of improved in terms of hardware, how the things perform. I put a link there to the lightweight Linux distributions, which you're welcome to actually look up and in your own time. But if I move on to the next slide, I was just trying to sort of obviously give you other things which you can follow up on, if you are interested in Linux, and to give you a picture of the impact on it. Well, one of the The boosters for Linux, of course, was the 2012 launch of the UK Raspberry Pi, which I've been involved with sort of in delivery with STEM, and also we use here. I've got project students using Raspberry Pi. It's been a back to hands-on really, which of course is the idea through schools to actually, instead of it just being a box, we wheel out onto a laptop column, say, there's the laptop, run this application. They'd have no idea what's inside there. We went back to saying, well, this is a board. I did bring one with me, but I was just going to show up. But I'm sure you know what a Raspberry Pi looks like. It just looks like a motherboard, really. But of course, it's a computer, and you can actually. Typically, the actual OS which comes with it as a default is Raspbian, which is a sort of a version of Linux, which is delivered as a default for the little SD card, which goes to the Raspberry Pi. So this boosted the Linux quite a bit, really. It's sort of, well, what's this? People, bought a Raspberry Pi and I said, okay, what do I have to do? I have to start it up, and all sorts of things would appear. And then you could get to the command line interface, say, okay, what do I do next? And you could actually use a GUI, but typically you could also go into the command line interface and actually get very hands-on with the device. And of course, I should mention Arduino as well. There are other things out there, but Arduino and Raspberry Pi are the sort of the not hobby things, because they can actually be used by business, but certainly has been a welcome introduction to, in a sense, old school computing, to try and sort of bring people into it to understand, how does that actually work? What's being activated? Next slide, please. So you in Linux, I talked about me in Linux, and I could talk about that until it has gone dark, until it goes light. But really, you have a think about Linux. If you're not using it at the moment, you could perhaps sort of have a think about why. What are you looking for? So this is the kind of conversation I typically have with a small firm who are looking to have some sort of change in their IT infrastructure. They're trying to wean off perhaps some license fees and say, well, what could we use? I say, well, you could go down the open source route. Okay, what's that? They're looking for high performance, of course. You would be looking for that. You need to establish, well, is it client side or server side you want? So it's a desktop, or is it going to be a server deployment? Either are acceptable with Linux. You're looking to outsource the IT, i.e. the sort of the actual looking after it type of aspect. You can outsource to a CSP, a provider. What's the budget? And it's an alternative to Windows, which I find with small firms, they don't actually realize they've just used Windows for the last 20 years and think, well, why would we go away from that? Well, for all the reasons I just mentioned, really. Fundamentally, those last 2 points are quite interesting, really, that if you do move to sort of Linux as being your fundamental OS in your firm, then you are joining something which is community-based. It's got a big fan club. It's got lots of active users. You'll see in a moment a link to a big project with the NHS, which is ongoing at the moment. So you've got this collaborative forum. You're not on your own. You can sort of get help. You can sort of look for sort of other examples. There's a massive database of examples to sort of help you along. So you can get involved, really, which I think it makes it different. It makes it feel like you're sort of on a voyage, really, and it can be something which can help the firm, the individual, but at the same time you can learn and sort of pick up sort of other aspects of it. So you start off with small, and then you sort of gradually build up your knowledge of what's going on. Okay, so things for you to consider, really, if you're not using Linux. It could actually save you some money, and it might be it improves the performance. Next slide, please. Okay, what do we do here at Staffs Uni? Well, Linux is in the level 4 curriculum. Certainly we introduce it really to instruct the students to understand what is an operating system, what does it contain. So we start off with the basic command lines, and we use I've got a couple of screen grabs coming up in a moment without the mouse. So it's really all command line driven. Setting up files, setting up directories, learning to get around. Okay, and then they can move on to a shell. So a shell, obviously, being a little bit more nicer to navigate around, and they can start to install software, and they can start to design structures for their files, etc., etc. So things like Bourne shells, C shell, all these kind of things. But the fundamental starting point is the command line, which you can imagine for students who have been sort of grown up in a Windows environment, if they haven't been exposed to something like the Raspberry Pi, they've gone through school using something like a Windows environment, it's a bit of a shock at first. It's just sort of blinking at them, expecting something to happen. Well, I have to type that in. Yes. And but they soon sort of get their way around it, and they're picking up all sorts of, extra info about, well, oh, that's interesting. How does that permissions, for example, you can actually see them, and you can start to sort of control what you're doing. So taking a little bit of control back rather than just sort of gliding around with the mouse. So it remains, it's perhaps not as big a part of a structure as it used to be in terms of operating systems. We had a whole module on it years ago, and Carl will remember that. And we did all sorts of, sort of the design of operating systems and the different types that are out there. But the open source that Linux represents, it's getting sort of into how to use it really, which is important. All the other stuff tends to sort of arrive as you get more knowledge about the environment. Next slide, please. Okay, so a good example of what we get them to do is housekeeping really, navigating the directories, thinking about naming conventions. Think of how many files you receive by email or sort of shared with you in various ways. People don't often think about naming conventions of files. They just sort of send you think, well, what is this file? And when you start searching for it, well, now what was it called? So I find that all the time, really. So things like, there's a directory name here, of course, servo motor. Of course, subdirectories would sort of be related to that. You think about really what you're trying to build. So we try and get them to think about the wider aspect rather than just commands and just running a command. We get them to think about, well, okay, does that make sense? And on to the next slide, please, Charlie. Okay, and probably have to click again, sorry. Yeah, and again, probably. Here's some examples of Linux at sort of command level, things like make directory, copy, move, removing things, fundamental things. You obviously can actually, and if I just go on to the next slide, I've got a couple of screen grabs from what we use here. So we do an introduction to Linux, and they work in it's an emulator essentially, so they don't have to load it on the actual lab PCs. We actually use it in the cloud, and they can actually sort of, with the screen there on the right-hand side, start to actually, do some activities. And soon they build up and we get them to do a screen grab of what they've done, and that can be part of their assessment. And if we just go on to the next slide, that's creating a file. Oh, there isn't a next slide, never mind. So that was an example. I must have taken the other one out. I did have another one there as well. So applications for Linux, massive range really. VPNs, penetration testing, obviously server side. A big use is with Internet of Things. So this idea of devices talking to other devices. So Linux is ideal for that. And it forms part of the IoT, part of that Industry 4 framework I mentioned. That's a big part of it. So automation of devices. It's ideal. Its footprint, as I mentioned, it's quite low, so it can be installed on all sorts of things. Cloud service providers use Linux extensively, and you've got various fancy things like software-defined networking and virtualization as well. And we go on to the next slide, please. So business areas, telecoms, mobile applications. You can see, I'm not going to go through the whole list there. An interesting one is this one for non-government organizations or non-profit organizations. Okay, that can include charities. And also this one here with transformation projects. So we talk about digital transformation all the time. Linux can be part of that transformation. It can be one of the building blocks to actually introduce. So a very prominent project at the moment is the open source NHS Transformation Directorate, and Linux is a big component of that. And I've put you the link. So you can actually volunteer to get involved in that as a Linux sort of enthusiast and help move it forward. So lots of transformation projects. That's something which I'm quite heavily involved with really in terms of digital transformation for SMEs. It's helping them actually use the technology out there to move and help the business move forward. And we'll just go on to the next slide. Thank you. So this is where it gets a little bit complicated. That I mentioned about the one side of the sword, the edge being that, of course, it's open source, and that's wonderful. It's community, it's collegiate. But the other side of the sword, you could argue, of course, is there's so many different versions of Linux. It's difficult to know which one to choose. The most popular one for home use is Linux Mint. That's the stats show that. But you can see here, Slackware is quite popular. There's so many to choose from, and they've all got slightly different flavors about what they're trying to actually do. So, you know, this is just a small list. There's more. These are the ones which I typically have used over the years, and would recommend. You know, they're all good. Some have gone by the by. You know, they sort of finished, but these are the main players now. And free, typically, you know, that's what you download. But if you do want a licensed product, and i.e. something where you've got the assurity that really the product is something that you can actually go back to the provider and say, this doesn't work, I'm not happy with that, I need training on this, then you know, some firms will go for the Red Hat Enterprise Linux offering, which is a license and it involves a fee. So with the open source example I've got in the first part of this slide, really, to some extent, you're not on your own, you're with collegiate software. It's the whole open source idea that really there's no guarantee something might work. Typically it will, but it might need a little bit of effort. Whereas with the Red Hat kind of providers, you've got an immediate sort of recourse to actually sort of say, well, we need some help on this, help us, you know, and we expect that to happen because we're paying for it. So you're back to that sort of, you know, if you pay for something, you expect a sort of level of service, a service level agreement. With the collegiate software, you can't really sort of insist on that. You're in the world of, well, we've got it working, we've tinkered with it, and we're happy with what's there. Okay, so that's the double edge, really. Okay, just moving on. Thank you. Okay, so moving on to the future, just sort of moving, I think I'm just about on time, really. Where are we now and where do we go with Linux? Well, you know, given the number of users in the world, given the number of things it's doing, it's here to stay. That is obviously, all the evidence shows that. And to some extent, I'm being a bit provocative in that second bullet point there, open source really has won, because the Unix sort of, you know, proprietary software, and it's not just Unix, but other proprietary softwares for OSs have disappeared, really. So Unix-like systems, you know, the Linux of these worlds, have actually won the day, even though it wasn't really a campaign. It was, you know, nobody was driving this. It was a collegiate thing, but it's overwhelmed really the actual proprietary market, and it's become almost like now the de facto. Well, why aren't we using open source? That's the kind of question which does appear now. Whereas if I think back a few years ago, if I said, well, open source, and people say, well, what's that mean? Oh, it's free. Oh, not sure about that. Yeah. Who else uses it? You know, this kind of conversation will actually take place. It's starting to actually, you could argue after 30 years, actually becoming more established, which is interesting. It's sort of matured, almost like that capability maturity model. It's on the curve and it's reached some sort of, let's see, that way, it's reached sort of top of the curve where it's actually now accepted as being a reliable choice for a business to actually sort of undertake. You could argue there's too much proliferation. On that previous slide where I showed you all the distros there, perhaps there's too many in the market. And that's part of what the Linux Foundation are trying to actually do, try and provide an overall standard and say this is the minimum standard that all the distros should actually comply with. But that's difficult to enforce. It's voluntary at the moment. So that's definitely worth a look at that link if you're further interested in the sort of the Linux. And I think we're on to the final slide now. So plenty of follow-up references for you to have a look at. The Linux Foundation I've already mentioned. You know, really, you've got this curious thing where Linux is decentralized. Nobody really owns it or controls it. But of course, really to some extent, we want it to be centralized. It's really rather like the fintech market at the moment with the banking. You know, the whole idea of fintech was to actually revolutionize the banking industry. But we need some regulation. So we want governments to be behind some of the fintech. So what we've seen in the cyber world, of course, with things like Bitcoins, of course, is a complete disaster over the last 6 months, where everything, the confidence has gone out of the market. Who's looking after it? I've lost all my money. And then what we're seeing now is government coins, gov coins, which are really sort of highly regulated. So do you go down that regulated route, or do you keep the freedom of the non-regulated? And I could argue that's bringing up things like a Brexit argument as well, but I think that's another topic another day. Brexit, I listened to a radio show today, and it's very split still about the opinions of what Brexit represented. To some extent, that's what happened here. Linux was like a Brexit. It was not a divorce, but a complete sort of revolution of really what OSs could be. So you can join in with the Linux community. Warning: once you start, really, you probably stay with it, because of course you just can't leave it alone, really. You sort of tinker with it, but you can do lots of wonderful things with it. So I would urge you to, if you're not using Linux at the moment, look at it from a server point of view. If you're doing server applications, whether that be your own server or obviously a hosted server, see what it can actually do for you. Look at your topology of what you've got within the firm at the moment. Look at your architecture, the enterprise architecture. See if it could have perhaps a revamp. Who is in charge of that architecture is always interesting. Try and find, what is our network? That's typically what I'm faced with. I say, well, can you show me a diagram of your network? And typically, I find some firms haven't really changed their architecture for some years, and it's easy just to carry on paying for something. You think, well, it works, we'll just leave it alone. Okay, and you think, well, we could do something different and save some money, perhaps sort of move into a different deployment, which is part of that cloud debate as well, which of course is raised for some years now. Security in the cloud, what is the cloud, who controls the cloud, what happens if the cloud goes wrong. So Linux is part of that from a server point of view, but also from the desktop. Fantastic, get it on your desktop. You don't have to go down the Windows route or similar. You can have all the applications you need really sort of running in a Linux environment. And I think that's it, Charlie. Oh, yes. There's other. Yes, that's it. I think I've mentioned that. So I use these links weekly, Computer Weekly. These are my comics, as I call them. And there's always news about Linux deployment, particularly things like local authorities, local boroughs, where they're looking to save money because of budgets. And even the big firms, particularly the crisis we've had with costs. So Linux suddenly, perhaps with what we're faced with at the moment, has got another platform to actually offer itself with, which of course is, well, we could do that effectively more cheaply. And let's have a review. What could we use? And so Linux is a player in that area. Okay, so look at some of the news stories which come up each week. You'll find Ramsgate, County Council, whatever, suddenly is deploying all their servers in a different environment, and they've got a project. It will be lots of those kind of stories appear every week, and that's, I think, the last slide, Charlie. So hopefully that's giving you a little bit of insight into Linux. I'm sure this.